welcome to part one of a two-part series on Government Policymaking 101, where I give some insight into the policymaking process in ways that I hope you'll find engaging, clear, and useful to your careers in advocacy. So this is a two-part series that will introduce you to the core concepts of government policymaking, helping to demystify the process for those of you that are outside of government so that you can better connect with public policy in your own work. In part one, I'm going to be unpacking questions about what public policy is, how it's made, and then when we get into part two, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into who's involved in the policymaking process and when. And then also looking at what are some of the strategies that we can use to impact public policy from outside of government. So before I dive into the content, I want to situate myself a bit more clearly in relation to the field of public policy by telling you a bit more about myself and how I think about public policy. So my name is Amanda Bucknia. My pronouns are she and her. And in my current role with Making the Shift, I primarily manage our international partnerships and collaborations to exchange knowledge on youth homelessness prevention through our designation as a Geneva UN Charter Center of Excellence. I'm also a doctoral candidate at the University of Guelph in their social practice and transformational change program, where I'm bridging my knowledge between public policy and critical community engaged scholarship to examine the ways that people with lived expertise are either included or sometimes excluded from those policymaking processes. Specifically, I'm looking at community planning. I'm a white settler of Irish, Scottish, and English and Ukrainian descent, and I'm based in Takaranto or Toronto, which is the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat people, and is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So when I talk about public policy, it's important to consider that there are a number of structural factors such as colonialism and white supremacy that are at play that need to be considered when we think about policy within the Canadian context. What I'm sharing draws on mainstream theories about how we understand policymaking in Canada. However, it's also important as we think about public policy to consider the ways that these processes were designed, who they were designed for, and who's typically systematically marginalized within the policy process. My understanding of public policy has evolved over time as I've engaged more deeply and learned more about Indigenous sovereignty, land back movements, along with other co-constituted struggles for justice, such as the movement for Black lives, disability justice, housing justice, and much, much more. I did my Master of Public Policy at University of Toronto, and I learned a lot about the mainstream ways that policy is understood and taught and practiced. My goal has since been to find ways to democratize that policy process and use that privileged knowledge that I've gained through academics and also through professional experience to give more people the tools to engage with and to critique, influence, and push back on the policymaking process. So in a way, this presentation is a summary of my degree, but also of my experience working within the policy field, really getting at some of those key aspects of policymaking so you can start to think about where your work fits, whether that might be in research, perhaps frontline practice, advocacy, or even taking on roles within the public service or in government yourself. I firmly believe that there's so much more work to be done to make policy accessible and to assert the perspectives of people that have been historically marginalized through policy processes. So with that, let's jump into the content. So let's start with a fairly basic question of what is public policy? And this is like kind of a term that we hear thrown around a lot. You hear the term policy in various contexts, especially around election time. You'll hear about policy platforms that parties are putting out, or you might hear political pundits saying things like good policy or bad policy. But how does it actually work? What is it? How does it get made? What does it encompass? Have you ever tried to define it before? Or have you heard a definition ever actually shared when people talk about policy? So is it things like bills and legislation, rules and regulations, taxation rates, credits, zoning? Yes, and it's all of those things and more. And specifically, we're focusing in on the policy that's made by governments. We also have policies that impact things like there's nonprofit policy that dictates how a nonprofit is run, or like there's policy in all kinds of spaces. But what we're really focusing in on is what government makes in terms of policy. It encompasses a huge swath of various things that impact pretty much every aspect of our day-to-day lives. So Let's start with a pretty basic definition of what public policy is that we can use to work with. So Howlett, Ramesh, and Pearl, which are a group of academics in political science and public administration, they define public policy as government's decided course of action or inaction on a public issue. So let's break that down piece by piece. Government. So government's the main player involved. They're making a decision. So there's a choice to be made. And then on a course of action or inaction, which means that governments can choose to either make a change or even keep the status quo. They can decide not to act. And in some cases that's politically feasible because maybe there's an issue that's too hot to touch at a political moment, such as leading up to an election where it could make or break parties' possibility of getting reelected. And then on a public issue. So this is an issue that's been defined as a problem that has relevance to the public that the government's representing. Okay, so if we've got this definition of public policy, let's dig into how it gets made. So let's take a look into the policy making process. So the policy process, in theory at least, can be looked at in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's represented as a 6-stage model. I'm going to talk about it in this 5-stage model that you see along the right side of the screen, which goes from agenda setting to policy formulation to decision making, implementation, and evaluation. And while that sounds like a nice linear process, in practice, it's actually much more iterative and not as straightforward as just going from A to E in this case. So what happens typically is that, yes, there's an agenda setting phase that policy issues get taken up, but sometimes they don't always make it down to evaluation. Sometimes governments change direction or elections happen and governments change. So you may make it through the whole process. Sometimes you make it to the end and need to start all the way back at the beginning. And these processes are politically fraught. So we're going to use this as basically a template to think about how to engage with government policymaking, though we have to understand it as an imperfect and iterative process that's not as linear as it may look on the screen. So to start, we have agenda setting. So in agenda setting, we have basically we're trying to figure out as a government, what are the issues that we're going to be taking up? What are the issues that matter to us? What are the things that we're going to take action on and create policy around? And one of the key things that informs the government's decision about what to do and what issues matter to them and what they should take action on is the division of powers that's set out in the Constitution. So the Constitution Act of 1867 said that the federal government and the provincial government have different responsibilities, and they list them out in the list that you see below, with only agriculture and immigration being the 2 responsibilities that are shared between governments. They are equal in the eyes of the Constitution. So provinces are on equal standing with the federal government. It is not a hierarchy in Canada. Despite the fact that we kind of may think about it that way, constitutionally, they're on equal footing. So when we think about the initial way that the government looks at what is their responsibility, they'll look to that division of powers to say, this is within our mandate as the federal government, or that's outside of our jurisdiction, that's actually provincial. So a question you may have is, so where do municipalities fit into all of this? The cities, the towns, the regions. If you click one more time, we'll see that the division of powers and our constitution actually doesn't recognize municipalities as their own entities. They are what are called creatures of the provinces. They are set up on the whims of provinces. Their powers and the things that they oversee are based on what the provinces are willing to offer to municipalities. So over time, we've seen municipalities actually grow their responsibilities quite significantly. And this is a topic that's quite contentious because as municipalities have been handed a number of responsibilities in a lot of different aspects of our lives, from bylaws to municipal sewage, emergency services, all of these different aspects that play out in people's lives on a day-to-day basis, municipalities don't have the same kind of fundraising capacity that federal and provincial governments have. They're very limited in what they can actually do to increase the funds that come in to deliver the services they provide. They rely a lot on funding from the federal and provincial governments, and sometimes feel that they're constrained by the fact that they can't raise money that they need to deliver on what they would like to do for their constituents. Another thing to note in this is that what's not recognized within the Constitution Act is Indigenous sovereignty and forms of government. And that's something we have to contend with, and that people are contending with more and more in public policy, is not just considering what's the responsibility of these different orders of government, but how should these orders of government work alongside and in collaboration with Indigenous governments. So, okay, so we've got the division of powers. There are things that governments are responsible for, but within each of those buckets, such as immigration or housing or education, there are so many different issues to consider. And so, what is it that actually makes an issue get onto a government's agenda, and why are other things ignored? So, one of the things we have to consider is that governments are taking into consideration their constituents and who is informing what issues kind of get onto their radar. Um, when we look at basically like the fact that there are a couple of constraints on government, such as time limits. Governments are typically in power for up to 4 years. Maybe they'll get reelected, but that also constrains the way that they think about what issues are important to them. And also, when governments come into power, much of the funding that they have in their budgets is already allocated. So they have to figure out, how are we going to use the funding that's not allocated, or how are we going to rearrange things? What are we going to prioritize? And so the issues that government might address are typically informed by interest groups with varying different amounts of sway on the public or private sector that can say, hey, these issues matter to your constituents. And ideally, we would think that government politicians are wanting to be responsive to their constituents, that they're going to have their constituents' best interests in mind. Though we also know that getting reelected is something that politicians are also interested in. So um, sometimes they won't deal with issues because, as I said, they're too contentious to deal with at a certain moment. But identifying those issues and doing research and analysis on the issues that might be something that the government wants to take up is typically a very political process, because governments are going to decide to pick issues that have clear alignment with their mandates when they come into power. So, for example, if a government comes in with a policy platform that they had run within their election, that may sort of kind of put constraints around what issues they're going to take up, what issues are going to matter to them when they then go into making policy. And this is often where we see a lot of public engagement. If the government has their platform, they're going to want to engage with people in the public to hear more about how they should address those issues. And while there's definitely strong incentive to get reelected, there are many politicians that are looking at, what are my constituents saying? Some politicians, more than others, are much more responsive to what their constituents want to have brought up to the level of the government. Um, and how they define the various needs and voices that they respond to is going to change from government to government as well. So once the agenda has been set and the issue area has been researched and analyzed, in this agenda setting phase, they're really defining what the problem is and how they might want to think about the solutions. Then it's time for us to kick into the next stage of the policy process, which is policy formulation. Okay, so in policy formulation, there's a number of different tools that governments have at their disposal, each with their own benefits and drawbacks about what kind of actors are involved, the resources that they need, and the networks they need to carry them out. And they range from the least intrusive and least resource intensive to more intrusive or most resource intensive. And so I'm going to characterize this as a scale from duct tape to dynamite. Where on the duct tape end of things, we have things like public education, just making awareness campaigns, to the dynamite end of the scale, which is laws and penalties or regulations, which require not just saying that you have a law, but to actually have the resources to enforce those laws and penalties. And so everything is at their disposal, and the government can decide that they want to take a more light touch. They may decide that behavior change requires a bit more action. So things that are included in behavioral changes are things like taxes. So for example, we have things that are called sin taxes or vice taxes. We tax alcohol quite heavily. We tax gambling. The idea is that if people are going to engage in these behaviors that are either negative for their health or for society, that the government would collect funds that would then go to fund other social programs to basically try to balance out the impacts of those vices. They can also decide that they're going to make standards or prescribe or prohibit activities. And they can also do things like maybe create a grant or a subsidy that could incentivize people to do things. For example, grants to incentivize research and development, or subsidies that make it easier for people to afford green energy and retrofitting their homes. They can also provide direct services. So they may design their own program that they deliver, or that they deliver through other networks. So maybe they say that we're going to pursue developing a program or service, but it's going to be delivered by the private sector or the nonprofit sector, et cetera. So let's take a look at an example. We have an image on the right here of a person texting and driving. So when governments think about how do we curb texting and driving, they look at the range of tools. And if we click one more time, we can see that one of the things they might be able to do is to, on the kind of like duct tape end of things, do some public education. We've all seen signs, advertisements about the dangers of texting and driving and to arrive alive. And then if you click one more time, you can also see that there's a bit of a combination between the duct tape and the dynamite, where there are laws and penalties and regulations, fines that happen, demerit points if you're caught texting and driving. So they want to balance out the two, because on the more resource intensive end, the more punitive side of things, that requires enforcement. It requires having people that are monitoring people's driving habits, pulling people over when they're texting and driving. But hopefully we could curb more of the texting and driving by making people aware of how dangerous it is. So something to note here in this policy formulation stage is that the politicians aren't typically the ones doing the bulk of the work. They rely heavily on the bureaucracy, so the hired staff that is politically neutral. I mean, they carry their own biases with them, but they're not hired directly by politicians or political parties. They're hired to work within ministries and departments. They stay there longer term. Many of them are career bureaucrats, so they'll work for 20 plus years in the bureaucracy. They carry the institutional memory. So as governments change over, there's staff there that know what policies have been made before, that are continuously doing research about what's the latest knowledge on different policy issues that are relevant to that ministry. And they're able to provide sound political advice on what are the different policy tools that we could use, what are the implications of those tools, cost benefit analysis, and feasibility. Other times, governments may reach out outside of government to get support on policy formulation. That's where we see, for example, consulting firms hired to do some research and explore different policy options, do public engagement, and those kinds of things. Government can do some of that in-house, but sometimes they choose to go with different policy firms that have more expertise in different areas. And also, they will rely on research that's happening outside of government, outside of those public consulting firms. So research think tanks and research institutions or organizations such as the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness can also have an impact on the policy formulation stage, if we're being very mindful of making sure that the research we're doing connects with the policy recommendations that we want to put forward. So in this situation in policy formulation, it's really the job of the bureaucrats to match the right policy tool or issue to achieve the aims that the government has, to minimize those risks or costs that may incur, and also to minimize the negative or unintended consequences that could come about by implementing a certain policy option. But at the end of the day, the choice is up to the government that's in power, the politicians, the ministers, the cabinet, to set the actual policy choice. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're getting to the point where government needs to make a decision about what actual policy option they're going to choose. They've been presented with a number of options and information and expertise. And so now they have to decide, based on the information they have, based on their responsibility to their constituents, and based on their party platform and their mandate as a government, what are they going to do? And some of what they may be considering is this an issue that their voting public could decide that if they go down a certain path, they're going to maybe not vote them in the next time around? These are all things that the politicians have to be weighing. Now, in political science, there's some theorization around how decisions are made. There are a number of different high-level theories about decision making. So some of the different theories include the rational model, which says that governments use the very basic scientific method to do cost-benefit analysis, and they're going to go with the most logical option available. A little bit of a take on that says, like they may go with the most cost benefit efficient sort of option. Typically changes aren't that big, or they're typically more incremental. We won't see major swings in policy or big policies being pushed through, because the decisions on a day-to-day from government to government are very small, typically just building on top of one another. And in a similar vein, some theorists have said, yes, most of the time things are incremental, but there's punctuated equilibrium. There are moments where there are what we call policy windows that open up, where big policy changes can get pushed through. So, for example, there may be opportunities to push through new policy issues during predictable policy windows, such as elections or budget time, which we can predict because they happen on a regular basis. So at election time, there can be issues that people push to the forefront and get onto the policy agenda, and then get some decisions made around. Other times there's random policy windows that open up. Sometimes that's because of natural disasters and having to act very quickly, or public tragedies, things that drive the government to have to act in a very rapid manner. And then there are other theories like the garbage can model that says, like government is developing ideas and doing research all the time around different policy issues and possible solutions. So when there are moments that an issue comes up, they can kind of dig around in the garbage can, pull something out, and hope that it sticks and works. But all of these decision-making models, and there are many, many others, why does it matter to us? So click one more time and we'll see that like what really matters to us is, actually one more time, what really matters to us is not how governments decide on what decisions to make, but that it's more about how we respond to those decisions. So ultimately, governments are going to make a decision. It's more about what do we actually think and do when we see a decision or a direction that's been made. Because what happens when a government says this is the direction we're going to take is that it's not overnight that a policy is then taken up and implemented. There's typically a bit of a runway. So governments will announce a policy direction. Sometimes they may have every intention to go into implementation. Other times there may be a policy announcements made just to test the waters of how the public's going to respond. Is this something that we really want to do, or is it maybe something that turns out to be too politically contentious, so we're going to walk it back? So our responsibility as people outside of government is to take a second and think, how am I going to, what does this policy decision mean for me, for my organization, for my community? And we can then sort of think about how are we going to be involved in that rollout, in that runway time of refining the policy, because basically when a decision's made, it's just a signal of here's the direction we're going to go. But the actual roadmap of how they're going to get there hasn't fully been fleshed out. There's maybe even a year or more between when a government announces a policy and when they actually go to implement. So with all that said and done, we've made it through the first 3 stages of the policy process. Now I want to take you through an example that kind of shows you how these 3 stages played out and in practice at the federal level. Okay, so in 2015, when the Trudeau Liberal government, actually not government at the time, the political party under Justin Trudeau's leadership announced that they were going to be running, they decided to do something that was kind of interesting in terms of putting together a policy platform. This is a screenshot from their website, which had a number of different issues listed that you could click on and learn a little bit more about. And what they invited the public to do, if you click one more time, was that they were invited to actually rate those different issues. So you can see in the middle of the screen, like that one of the issues, post-secondary education, is highlighted. It has stars. So they did basically a crowdfunding of what are the issues that matter to our voters, to our constituents. So people could go through and vote for each of these different issues. So by the time they were elected, they were able to come in and say, here's our platform, here's what people have told us they want us to do. which is one of the things that contributed to the desire to create a national housing strategy. So in 2018, we are actually even earlier than that, 2017, there was a publication that they put out that was summarizing all of the information they had heard when they asked for reports and did some public consultations about what should be included in a national housing strategy. What are the key considerations they should have? And so basically they had done a year of gathering information to help them with the policy formulation stage. So they had their agenda setting, getting their platform made. They moved into policy formulation, doing the consultations, hearing from experts, setting up an expert advisory committee. And then if we go click one more time, then that resulted in 2018 getting to Canada's national housing strategy. So when this was released, there were a lot of mixed reviews about the actual policy. A lot of concerns that raised up within our own network saying like, this has very little information. It doesn't say how much money is allocated. It doesn't say how they're going to do it. This is a terrible strategy. And so alarm bells started going off all over the place. But the thing to keep in mind was, again, going back to that decision-making phase, this was signaling the direction, but it hadn't signaled or hadn't really detailed what was actually going to be the implementation. There was over a year's worth of consultations and work to be done within the government and with different key stakeholders outside of government to decide how do we implement this. So there were actually quite a number of opportunities for us to get more deeply involved in figuring out how it was going to roll out, to raise our concerns, to raise our questions, and for government to be able to respond to that and to then move into implementation. So that kind of gives you a sense of like, there's ultimately from 2015 to 2018, that was like 3 years of building toward a signal of where they were going to go with a national housing strategy, with still another year yet to actually move into implementation. It wasn't until really into 2019 that we saw many of the programs that were outlined in that original document start to come into play. That moves us into implementation. So implementation is an extremely crucial phase. It's really where policies either go to live or to die. And so governments need to do everything in their power to ensure that the policy direction that they've signaled, that they've decided on, is going to have its intended impact. But poor implementation can lead to unintended negative consequences. So if we think about our Dr. Frankenstein here on the left, he's developed a policy that he thinks is great. And if you click once, he's really hoping that this policy is going to work as expected and have its intended impact. It's going to sing and dance. It's going to be wonderful. He's created a perfect policy. But if you click one more time, sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes the policy ends up being a monster that ends up throwing children into the river. And that is something that governments are really, really trying to avoid. So it's heavily reliant on this stage that the government works across a delivery network. As I say on the slide here, governments don't do all the governance. Governance itself is something that's much more complicated. It involves a lot more different players. Governments themselves, they set the direction, but they rely on the public sector, the nonprofit sector, the private sector, all of these different actors involved to actually implement their policies. So they need to do a lot of homework in the lead up to implementation to assess how that network of governance is actually going to take up a policy and the kinds of supports and strategies that they're going to need to have it roll out smoothly. If it's new legislation, they may do some public awareness campaigns to let people know about the changes that are coming into play. What is going to be the impact on specific workplaces or key service providers? If it's a new program that's going to be provided by a frontline service delivery organization, they may need to develop new training, new resources that they can send out in advance of implementation to make sure things are set up well. There's an extensive amount of issues mapping to identify who those stakeholders are so that they're not missing anybody who may be crucial in the actual rollout, and who they need to kind of bring into that process and get on side to actually get moving with that policy. Or at least if people aren't interested, maybe the policy is something they don't agree with, how are they going to manage those stakeholders that may be resistant? So that goes, that requires a lot of different skills and competencies that they need to maybe strengthen within the network. And sometimes ultimately, though, as much preparation as they can do in that preparation for implementation, sometimes policies just are great on paper, but they just don't work in practice. And so the service delivery network may not be prepared or not adequately resourced to implement a policy. As ideal as it would be if we were going to deliver a new program or set a new direction from a government, if there's just not the resources there to support people along with implementation, it may just not work. And there is risk in that. If we have policy ideas that we want to advance, or programs that we think are really incredible and important or innovative, we need to be careful when we're working with government that we advocate for the resources to get them to be properly implemented. It's one thing to say, hey, we've got this great program idea, let's implement it. And the government says, this is the mandate for all of the service organizations now. If they don't provide training, technical assistance, funding to make changes, to hire new people, to do all of these things on the ground, it could end up actually harming the reputation of a program that works in practice, has evidence behind it, but only in specific cases where we can ensure fidelity. So what are some of the reasons that a policy might fail? Some of the things are just around like staff burnout. They may implement a policy or a program that's heavily resource intensive, but they don't fund it properly, they don't staff it properly. And then also sometimes there's a political climate at the community level where the implementation environment is actually totally at odds with that policy change. There's any number of challenges that can get in the way of implementation going well. So there's tricky questions that governments have to navigate through implementation around governance and who's going to do what are the outcomes and the targets that we want to see, how can we incentivize people to achieve those targets through things like funding mandates, and how will we actually know that the policy is working. So as organizations outside of government, we can help with that implementation phase by really thinking about how are we connected to that delivery network, that level of governance when the policy is implemented. How can we either support and resource the communities to take up that policy well, or how can we also be tracking, maybe as policies being implemented, the ways that it might not be working that well. Next slide. So that leads us to evaluation. Evaluation is incredibly important. If we say that we're going to create as a government a policy or program and that it's going to make some change, it makes sense that as a government, we'd want to also check our progress, see how we're doing, and use impact evaluation and performance management techniques to really see, is the policy that we've set out doing the work that we thought it would do? But it's actually only fairly recently in government history that governments have really pursued policy and program evaluation in a rigorous way, that they've funded it rigorously. And to the degree to which that a policy or program is evaluated, it's very volatile to the influence of the government of the day. It's an incredibly political process. In most cases, policies are going to be developed and implemented concurrently with a plan for how they're going to measure progress. So when it's getting to that decision making and moving into implementation, typically governments are already thinking, how are we going to know that this is working? What are we going to track? What are the sort of impact analysis metrics that we're going to be using? However, there's also an incentive where if you don't measure success, you can't actually be confronted with the data to do anything differently. So there's a perverse incentive to not collect data if you don't actually want to know the impact of a policy, because the impact may not be good. It may not be something that the public wants to hear. So what really matters here is how success is defined, and how it's defined is very political. It's all about how the problem is defined. And those definitions are something that that's set out well before the policy is actually implemented. It's in the agenda setting phase. And so sometimes the policies that we see that get rolled out that we're going, that's a terrible decision. Like, why would somebody go in that direction? We need to think about how are they defining the problem, because it may be that they are viewing it very differently than we are. So a great exercise for you to do as you see policies get implemented, and especially policies that you go, why would anybody pursue this direction as a policy? Why would anybody implement a policy like this? The things you should ask yourself is, what is the motivation behind this policy? How does it align with the government's priorities? How did they define the problem? And how are they defining success? Those are all really important questions. And I'm going to give an example of what this can look like in practice. An example of where the kind of definition of the problem and definition of success, and also even definition of the solution, can be a bit muddled, is with the concept of basic income. So is basic income a nonpartisan no-brainer? This graphic was on the internet. It says basic income is not left or right, it's forward. So when we were having big conversations in Ontario around basic income leading up to the pilot project in between 2016 and 2018, there was a lot of talk across the aisle between political parties about the need for basic income and support, not just from Liberal and NDP MPPs, but also from Conservatives. For example, Hugh Segal, who is a longtime Conservative staffer and politician, wrote a position paper that was published by the Wynne government saying that we need to make a case for a basic income pilot, and claiming that it is something that we can all kind of get on board with as being necessary as a policy direction to support people. So on its face, yes, absolutely. Hugh Segal, to an extent, is correct. Like there was a lot of support for basic income across the aisle, but the question is, once it gets into the details of the policy, how it's designed, and that definition of the problem and the definition of success really starts to change how we view it. If you click one more time, some people would view basic income as something that we add on top of our current social safety net as an added buffer and support to people to lift more people up out of poverty, give them more options for things like going back to school, taking their time to find a job that actually is well suited to their experience or to their interests, and that may be longer term, permanent, have benefits, all those things. Other folks may view basic income as a replacement for all of our other social programs. It's going to replace social assistance. It's going to replace disability supports. It's going to replace old age supports. So when we're looking at basic income in practice, understanding who's at the head of implementing basic income, what is their goal around having a basic income, those questions become very, very important for understanding whether this is a policy that actually is nonpartisan, or maybe there is some partisanness within it that we just don't see on its face. Okay, so that's the policymaking process. Just to kind of summarize from beginning to end, because that was a lot of information, we have the agenda setting process, which is where governments, they have their mandates through the Constitution about what issues are within their jurisdiction, and they need to decide what issues they're going to address during their tenure, what issues their constituents and public and private interests have said they need to address. Then there's policy formulation, where bureaucrats, consultants, researchers, and the public really inform the formulation of a suite of different options for the government to choose from. Then there's decision making, where government makes decisions, but we can also inform the rollout. We know that there's like a lead time between when a government's decision is made and when it's actually implemented. There's the implementation phase, where policies really live or die depending on how well they've set up that phase for implementation. And then there's evaluation, which is something that can tell us that a policy has worked or not, but we need to be aware of the different political framing that may come into play when thinking about the problem definition and success definition. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our Government and Policymaking 101. In part 2, we're going to get into more of how to influence the policy process, building on what you've learned today. But thanks so much for watching, and we'll hope to see you in the next one.